At 8:10 a.m. on the 23rd of May, 1903, a Winton touring car rolled out of the garage of the University Club in San Francisco. It was a light green automobile, hand-built, with no roof, no windshield, and a top speed of about 30 miles per hour. Behind the wheel sat Dr. Horatio Nelson Jackson, a 31-year-old Vermont physician who had come to California for a vacation. Next to him was Sewell K. Crocker, a mechanic and bicycle racer who had been hired the night before as a driver and assistant. The car was named the Vermont after Jackson's home state. Everything seemed normal. Only a few minutes later, something was off. The car had barely crossed the city limits when a fuel line clogged. Crocker crawled underneath and cleared it with a piece of wire. They resumed driving. By noon, they had covered only about 40 miles. The roads were not roads in any modern. They were rutted wagon tracks, dusty paths, and in many places simply open desert. Jackson had no map of the route ahead. He had only a general idea of the railroad lines that ran from San Francisco to New York. He intended to follow those lines, but the tracks did not always align with the dirt paths. On the second day, the Vermont lost its horn. On the third day, a rear spring snapped near Sacramento. Jackson sent a telegram to the Winton Motor Carriage Company in Cleveland, Ohio, asking for a replacement part. No reply came. He and Crocker found a blacksmith who fashioned a crude repair with iron brackets and leather straps. They drove on. By the fifth day, they had crossed the Sierra Nevada mountains, but the grades were steep and the engine overheated repeatedly. They stopped for water at every stream they found. At 9:45 a.m. on the 1st of June, 1903, 10 days into the journey, the Vermont broke a driveshaft in the remote high desert of Nevada. There was no town within 50 miles. Jackson and Crocker had no spare parts and no way to communicate with the outside world. They tied a rope to the car and tried to tow it with a horse they borrowed from a passing rancher. The rancher had never seen an automobile before. He agreed to help in exchange for a ride. The towing failed. The car would not move. Jackson then convinced the rancher to take him to the nearest railroad stop, a small station called Luning. From there, he telegraphed the Winton factory and a local machine shop in Reno. A replacement shaft was shipped by train. Jackson and Crocker waited 6 days in the desert, camping under the car, drinking from a nearby spring. On the 7th of June, the part arrived. They installed it by hand and resumed traveling. The journey now became a race against time and against exhaustion. Jackson had made the trip on a bet. A year earlier, at a dinner club in San Francisco, he had argued with other wealthy men that the automobile was a reliable machine capable of crossing the continent. They had wagered $50 each, a total of several $1,000s in modern money. Jackson had never driven a car across a state line. He had never driven more than 100 miles in a single day, but he was stubborn. By mid-June, the Vermont had crossed into Utah. The roads were worse. Sand slowed them to a crawl. The engine overheated so often that Crocker rigged a canvas water bag on the front bumper, letting it drip onto the radiator as they drove. They improvised. They burned sagebrush when they ran out of wood. They used a shotgun to hunt jackrabbits for food. They slept in the car or on the ground. Jackson kept a detailed journal of every breakdown, every repair, every mile. At 2:15 p.m. on the 19th of June, the Vermont hit a deep rut near the town of Eureka, Utah, and the steering column snapped. The car swerved into a ditch. Jackson was thrown from his seat but not injured. Crocker was pinned against the steering wheel. The car was immobile. They were in the middle of an empty basin. No houses, no water, no shade. They spent the rest of the day rigging a rope steering system. By nightfall, they could turn the wheels by pulling on 2 ropes tied to the front axle. It was crude, dangerous, and barely functional. They drove like this for 2 days, steering by hand from inside the car. On the 21st of June, they reached the town of Price, Utah, where a local mechanic welded the broken column back together. They paid him $5. It was the most expensive repair of the trip. By early July, they had crossed Wyoming and entered Nebraska. The flat plains allowed them to make better time, but the heat was punishing. The Vermont had no top, no windshield, no shade. Jackson wore a heavy coat to prevent sunburn. Crocker wrapped his head in a wet towel. They drank water from muddy creeks and cow ponds. They stopped at farmhouses to ask for directions, but most farmers had never seen a motor vehicle. They pointed toward the next railroad track and wished them luck. At 10:30 a.m. on the 4th of July, 1903, the Vermont rolled into Cheyenne, Wyoming. Jackson wired his wife Bertha in Burlington, Vermont, to say he was alive. He also sent a telegram to the Winton factory asking for tires. The original tires were wearing thin. The factory shipped 4 new ones, but the train carrying them was delayed. Jackson and Crocker waited 3 days in Cheyenne. They changed the tires by hand. They also replaced a cracked cylinder head with a used part from a local hardware store. The final leg took them through Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and New York. The roads in the Midwest were improved but still unpaved. Rain turned them into mud. The Vermont bogged down repeatedly. On the 17th of July, near the town of Maumee, Ohio, the car broke down again. The engine refused to start. Jackson diagnosed a dead coil. He had no spare. He bought a brass lamp at a general store, disassembled it, and used the wire to create a temporary coil. It worked. He wrote in his journal, "The automobile is a machine that demands all of a man's ingenuity." At 4:30 p.m. on the 26th of July, 1903, 63 days after leaving San Francisco, Horatio Nelson Jackson drove the Vermont onto the streets of New York City. He had no plan for a ceremonial finish. He simply found his way to the western end of Fifth Avenue and drove south. By the time he reached Madison Square, a small crowd had gathered. Someone recognized the mud-caked car from newspaper reports. Jackson was stopped by a police officer who asked where he had come from. He said San Francisco. The officer did not believe him. Jackson showed him the journal. The officer let him pass. What happened? The journey of Horatio Nelson Jackson is widely considered the first successful crossing of the United States by automobile. But it was not a leisurely road trip. It was an expedition, a test of endurance for both man and machine. The car that completed the trip was not the same car that had left San Francisco. Nearly every major component had been repaired, replaced, or improvised. The tires were different, the springs were different, the steering had been rebuilt twice. The engine had been patched, the seats were torn, the paint was scratched beyond recognition, yet the car still ran. Jackson and Crocker were not the only people attempting such a crossing in 1903. A second team sponsored by the Packard Motor Car Company had started from San Francisco 2 weeks after Jackson. They had a support crew, a budget, and a better route. But they suffered their own breakdowns and did not reach New York until mid-August, later than Jackson. A third team in a one-cylinder Oldsmobile had started earlier but never finished. The car was abandoned in Kansas. Jackson had won the bet. The deeper story is not about a bet or a race. It is about the birth of a national idea. In 1903, the automobile was still a novelty. There were fewer than 10,000 cars in the entire United States. Most people considered them expensive toys, unreliable and impractical. Roads were not designed for cars. They were designed for horses and wagons. Gasoline was sold at hardware stores and pharmacies in unmarked cans. No maps existed for long-distance driving, no roadside assistance, no chain motels, no diners. The American road trip did not exist. What Jackson proved was that the automobile could go anywhere if the driver was determined enough. His journey caught the attention of newspapers across the country. Reporters followed his progress through telegrams and letters. When he arrived in New York, he was photographed and interviewed. His story was picked up by the Associated Press. Within weeks, other wealthy drivers were planning their own cross-country trips. By 1904, the Automobile Club of America had organized a transcontinental race. By 1905, several car manufacturers began publishing route guides. By 1909, the Lincoln Highway Association was formed to lay out a continuous paved road from New York to San Francisco. The systems that failed Jackson on that journey were not failures of engineering. They were failures of infrastructure. There was no national road network, no standardized fuel supply, no reliable maps. No communication system for stranded travelers. The automobile had arrived faster than the country could prepare for it. Jackson and his contemporaries had to invent solutions on the fly. They had to carry extra parts. They had to rely on blacksmiths, farmers, and telegraph operators. They had to trust their own mechanical instincts. Investigators today, historians and transportation scholars, look back at Jackson's journey not as a single event but as a turning point. It demonstrated that the car could replace the train for long-distance travel. It captured the public imagination. It planted the seed for a culture that would eventually celebrate the open road, the family vacation, the summer road trip. Within 20 years of Jackson's crossing, the number of registered automobiles in the United States had grown from a few thousand to over 8 million. The federal government began funding highway construction. The modern road trip was becoming possible. But the story of that first crossing also raises questions that remain unanswered in a broader sense. Could the great American road trip have been born without the stubbornness of a single man on a bet? How much of the country's car culture was shaped by the willingness of early drivers to endure hardship? And what was lost when the experience of long-distance travel shifted from adventure to convenience? The infrastructure that Jackson lacked is now taken for granted. The roads are paved, the gas stations are everywhere, the motels are standardized, the journey is easier. But the spirit of the road trip, the willingness to get lost, to fix your own car, to sleep under the stars, that spirit began with a machine that barely worked, a mechanic who had no training, and a doctor who refused to quit. At 8:10 a.m. on the 23rd of May 1903, a green automobile with no roof left a hotel garage in San Francisco. It was the first road trip. It was not planned, it was not comfortable, it was not safe, and it changed everything. But the story does not end there. On the 17th of July 1904, at 9 a.m., 6 automobiles lined up on a dirt street in San Francisco. They were about to begin the first organized transcontinental automobile race. The event was sponsored by the Automobile Club of America. The route would follow roughly the same path Jackson had taken the year before. The cars ranged from a powerful 4-cylinder Peerless to a small 1-cylinder Oldsmobile. Each driver carried spare parts, food, water, and a revolver. The rules were simple: drive to New York as fast as possible. No support crews were allowed beyond what each car could carry. The prize was a silver trophy and $1,000. The first car to leave was a Winton, the same brand Jackson had used. But this Winton was newer, more powerful, and better prepared. The driver was a man named L. Whitman, an experienced mechanic. At 9:15 a.m., he cleared the city limits and headed east. Behind him came a Packard, a Peerless, a Rambler, a Franklin, and the small Oldsmobile. The Oldsmobile was considered a joke. Its engine produced 4 horsepower. Its top speed was 20 miles per hour. The driver, a salesman named Dwight B. Huss, did not care. He planned to finish, even if it took months. Within the first day, the race became a battle against the same forces Jackson had faced. Roads disappeared into sand. Rivers had no bridges. The Winton broke a spring in the Sierra Nevada. The Peerless lost a wheel outside Reno. The Franklin overheated climbing a grade in Utah. The Oldsmobile, tiny and light, simply drove around the obstacles. Huss later wrote that the car was so small he could lift it out of mud holes by himself. He did that often. By the time the cars reached Nebraska, only 3 remained in contention: the Winton, the Packard, and the Oldsmobile. The others had dropped out due to mechanical failure or exhaustion. The Winton had the lead. Then on the 3rd of August near Grand Island, Nebraska, a connecting rod broke through the Winton's engine block. Whitman spent 3 days repairing it with a borrowed torch and a file. The Packard passed him. The Oldsmobile passed him too. By the time the Winton was running again, it was 2 weeks behind. The Packard reached Chicago on the 20th of August. The Oldsmobile arrived 2 days later. The Winton limped in a week after that. From Chicago, the race turned toward New York. The roads in Ohio and Pennsylvania were slightly better, but still rutted and dangerous. The Packard suffered a cracked cylinder head. The driver, Charles Schmidt, had to pour water into the crack and weld it with a piece of brass. The Oldsmobile, meanwhile, kept going. Huss had learned to drive at night to avoid the heat. He used oil lamps for headlights. He ate canned beans and slept in the car. At 4:30 p.m. on the 1st of September 1904, 46 days after leaving San Francisco, Dwight B. Huss drove the one-cylinder Oldsmobile onto the streets of New York City. He had finished second. Packard had arrived 3 days earlier, but Huss's achievement was arguably more impressive. His car had the least power, the smallest budget, and no spare parts network. He had repaired a broken carburetor with a piece of cardboard. He had replaced a cracked gear with a cog from a farm plow. He had driven through a hailstorm in Iowa with no windshield. When reporters asked him how he did it, he said, "I just kept moving." The 1904 race proved that Jackson's journey was not a fluke. The automobile could cross the continent reliably, even in the hands of ordinary drivers. But the race also revealed the limits of the existing infrastructure. Roads were still unmarked. Gasoline was still hard to find. A driver in western Kansas might go 200 miles without seeing a single service station. The cars themselves were fragile, breakdowns were expected, repairs were improvised. The journey demanded not only mechanical skill but also patience, resourcefulness, and a high tolerance for discomfort, yet the public response was electric. Newspapers across the country printed daily updates. Crowds gathered at checkpoints. In small towns, the arrival of a race car was a major event. Children ran alongside. Farmers stopped their plows to watch. The automobile was no longer a curiosity, it was a tool of adventure. The idea of driving across the country, once considered absurd, began to seem possible. What happened next was a cascade of change. In 1905, the American Automobile Association began publishing route guides. They were crude, often consisting of written descriptions of landmarks: turn left at the Red Barn, cross the creek, follow the telegraph poles. But they were a start. Drivers could now plan a route without relying entirely on local advice. Also in 1905, the first auto camps appeared. These were simple plots of land, often behind a farmer's house, where travelers could pitch a tent for a small fee. They were the ancestors of the modern motel. By 1908, the Ford Model T had entered production. It was cheap, reliable, and easy to repair. Mass production meant that ordinary families could afford a car. The number of registered automobiles in the United States jumped from 100,000 in 1908 to over 1 million in 1903. The road trip was no longer the preserve of wealthy adventurers. It was becoming a middle-class activity, but the roads remained the bottleneck. In 1909, a group of automobile enthusiasts and manufacturers formed the Lincoln Highway Association. Their goal was to create a single paved road from New York to San Francisco. The highway would be named after Abraham Lincoln. It would be a symbol of national unity. The association raised money from private donors and secured support from local governments. Construction began in 1912. By 1915, the Lincoln Highway was drivable for most of its length, though large sections were still gravel or dirt. It was the first transcontinental road designed specifically for automobiles. The impact was immediate. In the summer of 1916, thousands of families set out on the Lincoln Highway. They drove Model Ts and Buicks and overlands. They carried tents, cooking stoves, and spare tires. They stopped at auto camps, which by now had grown into organized tourist camps with bathrooms and grocery stores. They bought postcards and souvenirs. They took photographs. The American road trip as a leisure activity had arrived. At 7:45 a.m. on the 1st of July 1919, a convoy of military vehicles left the White House in Washington, D.C. It was a test of the nation's roads, organized by the U.S. Army. The convoy included trucks, ambulances, motorcycles, and a mobile field kitchen. Its mission was to drive to San Francisco along the Lincoln Highway and report on the condition of the route. The convoy was led by a young lieutenant colonel named Dwight D. Eisenhower. He would later become President of the United States. The convoy traveled at an average speed of 6 miles per hour. Roads were muddy, bridges collapsed, vehicles got stuck in sand. In the mountains of Wyoming, the convoy was delayed for 3 days by a washed-out road. Eisenhower wrote in his diary that the journey was a test of endurance. It took 62 days to cross the country. When Eisenhower became president in 1953, he remembered that convoy. He pushed for a national system of interstate highways. In 1956, the Federal Aid Highway Act was signed into law. It authorized the construction of 41,000 miles of divided, limited-access highways. The interstate highway system would be the largest public works project in American history. The interstate highways changed the road trip forever. They eliminated the need for careful route planning. They made long-distance driving fast and safe. They spawned a new industry of chain motels, fast food restaurants, and gas stations. The road trip became a ritual. Families packed into station wagons. Teenagers set out after graduation. Retirees bought RVs and toured the country. The open road was a symbol of freedom, but something was also lost. The interstate highways bypassed small towns. The two-lane roads that Jackson had traveled, the routes that passed through farm country and mountain passes, became secondary. The journey itself became a matter of covering distance. The adventure, the unpredictability, the need for ingenuity, those faded. The road trip became comfortable. It also became standardized. The question that remains is whether the spirit of Jackson's journey can still be found. On any given summer day, millions of Americans get into their cars and drive. They follow GPS directions. They stay at chain hotels. They eat at chain restaurants. They rarely break down. They never have to weld a steering column or rebuild a coil with lamp wire. The road trip is easier than ever. But the feeling of discovery, the sense of crossing a continent on your own terms, that feeling is still there. It is hidden beneath the convenience. It is waiting for anyone who turns off the interstate and takes the old road. At 10:15 a.m. on the 23rd of May, 2003, a group of vintage car enthusiasts gathered at the same hotel garage in San Francisco where Jackson had started his journey 100 years earlier. They drove a replica of the Vermont, a green Winton with no roof. They followed the same route as closely as possible. They took 2 months. They fixed breakdowns with whatever they could find. They slept in tents. They wrote journals. They arrived in New York on the 26th of July, exactly 100 years later. The crowd that greeted them was larger than the one that had greeted Jackson. But the feeling was the same. The road trip was still alive. How could this have happened? How could a single bet between two wealthy men in a San Francisco club produce a cultural phenomenon that would last for over a century? The answer is not in the bet itself. It is in the act. Jackson did not invent the road trip. He demonstrated that it was possible. He showed that a machine, no matter how unreliable, could carry a person across the continent. He endured the heat, the mud, the broken parts, the loneliness. He proved that the road was open. And once the road was open, people wanted to take it. The systems that failed Jackson in 1903 were the same systems that later succeeded. The lack of roads forced him to create his own route. The lack of maps forced him to ask for directions. The lack of gas stations forced him to carry extra fuel. These limitations were not failures. They were the conditions that made the journey a test of character. When the infrastructure improved, the test became easier, but the memory of the test remained. The road trip became a way to measure oneself against the land. Today, the Great American Road Trip is a cultural institution. It appears in movies, books, songs, and advertisements. It is a rite of passage. It is a retirement dream. It is a summer vacation, but its roots are in the stubbornness of a doctor who would not give up, a mechanic who learned on the job, and a car that was barely ready for the trip. That is where it began, and that is why it still matters. At 8:10 a.m. on the 23rd of May 1903, a green automobile with no roof left a hotel garage in San Francisco. It was the first road trip. It was not planned. It was not comfortable. It was not safe, and it changed everything. At 11:30 a.m. on the 11th of November 1926, a new highway was officially designated. It was called U.S. Route 66. It ran from Chicago to Los Angeles, a total of 2,448 miles. The route was cobbled together from existing roads, county highways, and dirt tracks. It was not paved, it was not straight, but it was the first highway to connect the Midwest to the Pacific coast. The announcement was made by the Bureau of Public Roads. Few people noticed. Within a decade, Route 66 would become the most famous road in America. What happened? The highway was created during a period of rapid road building. The federal government had begun numbering highways in 1925 to replace the patchwork of named trails. Route 66 was unique because it followed a diagonal path, cutting through the plains and the desert rather than running north-south or east-west. That made it the shortest route between Chicago and Los Angeles. Truck drivers used it, farmers used it. And when the Dust Bowl hit the Great Plains in the 193's, displaced families loaded their belongings onto trucks and followed Route 66 to California. John Steinbeck called it the Mother Road, the road of flight. The road trip became a migration. In 1937, the last unpaved section of Route 66 was graded and graveled in New Mexico. The highway was now drivable in any weather. Gas stations popped up every few miles. Tourist cabins and motor courts lined the roadside. By the late 1940s, neon signs advertised diners, Indian trading posts, and reptile farms. The road was not just a route, it was an experience. At 9:15 a.m. on the 14th of July, 1950, a family from Illinois stopped at the Blue Swallow Motel in Tucumcari, New Mexico. They had been driving for 3 days. The father had worked at a factory in Peoria. The mother had packed sandwiches and a thermos of coffee. The two children, ages 8 and 12, had never seen the desert. They checked into a room with 2 beds, a sink, and a radio. The neon sign outside showed a blue swallow in flight. The motel was one of hundreds that dotted Route 66. It cost $4 a night. The family would stay for 1 night, then continue west. The road trip by 1950 had become a middle-class ritual. The post-war economy meant that more families owned cars. Paid vacations were now common. The interstate highway system had been proposed but not yet built. Highway 66 carried as many as 10,000 cars per day in some sections. The traffic was heavy, but the road was narrow and two-lane. Accidents were frequent. Towns along the route competed for travelers. They built giant statues, teepee-shaped motels, and roadside attractions that promised a free glass of water or a giant curio shop. How could this have happened? How did a highway become a symbol of freedom? The answer lies in the combination of mobility and commerce. The road trip was no longer about survival or adventure. It was about consumption. Travelers bought gasoline, food, souvenirs, and lodging. The road became a marketplace, but it also became a narrative. Books, movies, and songs romanticized the open road. Jack Kerouac's On the Road, published in 1957, captured the restlessness of a generation. The highway was a line of possibility. Meanwhile, the condition of the roads was deteriorating. By the early 1950s, the Lincoln Highway and Route 66 were congested and dangerous. The Army had learned from the 1919 convoy that the nation needed better roads for defense. President Eisenhower, remembering his own cross-country ordeal, made highways a priority. In 1954, he proposed a 10-year, $50 billion plan to build 41,000 miles of divided highways. Congress debated the cost. Finally, on the 29th of June 1956, the Federal Aid Highway Act was signed into law. The interstate highway system was born. Construction began immediately. The first section opened in Kansas in 1957. Over the next 35 years, interstates were built through cities, mountains, and deserts. They were wide, smooth, and controlled by limited access. No stoplights, no cross-traffic. A driver could cross the country without slowing down. The new highways bypassed the small towns that had depended on traffic. Route 66 in particular was gradually replaced by interstates I-5, I-40, I-15, and I-10. By 1985, Route 66 was officially decommissioned. The road trip had been rerouted. But the spirit did not disappear, it adapted. In the 1960s, the Volkswagen Beetle became the unofficial car of the road trip. It was cheap, reliable, and easy to park. In 1967, a young couple from New York drove a Beetle to the Grand Canyon. They slept in a tent. They cooked over a campfire. They took photographs with a Kodak Instamatic. They were part of a wave of young travelers exploring the country on a budget. The road trip became a backdrop for self-discovery. At 6:30 p.m. on the 21st of August, 1969, a traffic jam stretched for 5 miles on the New York State Thruway. It was the start of the Woodstock Festival. Hundreds of thousands of people had taken to the roads in cars, vans, and buses. They were going to a dairy farm in Bethel, New York. The road trip was not the destination. It was the gathering. The highways carried a generation. What did investigators learn? Not in the forensic sense. But sociologists studied the patterns. The road trip had become a rite of passage, a way to test independence. The interstate made it faster, but the experience remained. In the 1970s, the oil crisis slowed long-distance driving. Gas prices spiked. Speed limits were lowered to 55 miles per hour. The road trip shrank in scale. Families stayed closer to home, but the desire did not fade, it just waited. By the 1980s, the road trip had become a nostalgic fantasy. Movies like National Lampoon's Vacation, released in 1983, turned the family road trip into comedy. The Griswolds drove a station wagon to Wally World. The car broke down, the kids fought, the dad lost his temper. It was funny because it was true. The road trip was messy, exhausting, and unforgettable. In the 1990s, the minivan replaced the station wagon. The SUV replaced the minivan. GPS technology began to appear. By the early 2000s, a driver could navigate the entire country without looking at a paper map. The road trip became efficient. But efficiency is not the same as adventure. The The generation that grew up with Google Maps had never experienced the thrill of being lost. They had never been forced to ask a stranger for directions, to discover a diner that was not on Yelp, to find a road that was not on the app. How did this change the road trip? It changed the nature of planning. Previously, a road trip required research, maps, and a willingness to improvise. Now it required a phone charger and a credit card. The physical journey became secondary to the digital experience, but the landscape remained. The mountains, the deserts, the small towns, they were still there. They just needed to be seen outside of the screen. At 10:45 a.m. on the 12th of September 2005, a woman named Cheryl Strayed stood on the side of the Pacific Crest Trail in Southern California. She had no car, she was hiking alone. But her journey was a road trip on foot. She wrote a book about it, Wild. The book became a film. It reminded people that the road trip is not about the vehicle. It is about the movement, the open space, the encounter with the unknown. The systems that failed the early road trippers, the lack of maps, the unreliable cars, the absence of services, those systems were replaced by a new set of failures. The failure to disconnect, the failure to be surprised, the failure to accept discomfort. The road trip had been smoothed into a predictable experience. But the memory of the original journey, Jackson's journey, remained as a counterpoint. In the summer of 2013, a couple from Portland, Oregon, restored a 1929 Ford Model A and drove it from San Francisco to New York. They followed the Lincoln Highway as closely as possible. The car had no air conditioning, no radio, no power steering. It broke down 6 times. They replaced a fuel pump with a bicycle tube. They slept in a tent. They met farmers, mechanics, and strangers who helped them. They arrived in New York 68 days later. They said the trip changed them. What does it mean? The Great American Road Trip is a story of infrastructure and desire. The roads were built for commerce and defense, but people used them for escape. The bet between Jackson and Winton was a wager on human ingenuity. The outcome was a nation that could be crossed in a week. The cost was the loss of local character. The benefit was access. The question is not whether the road trip survives, it does. The question is whether the spirit of the first journey, the willingness to fail, to fix, to ask, to endure, can survive the convenience. At 7 a.m. on the 4th of July 2019, a group of cyclists began a ride from the Golden Gate Bridge to the Brooklyn Bridge. They were following the route of the 1919 military convoy. They carried no spare parts. They had cell phones and credit cards, but they chose to ride bicycles. The road trip in its purest form is still being redefined. How could this have happened? How could a single drive across a continent become a cultural foundation? It happened because the drive was not about the destination. It was about the crossing. Jackson crossed the country in 63 days. He saw the plains, the rivers, the mountains, the towns. He saw the country as it was, and he told everyone. The road trip became a way to see America for yourself. The highways, the motels, the diners, the breakdowns, they are all part of the story. It is a story that continues. At 6:12 a.m. on the 26th of June 2021, a Tesla Model 3 pulled into a supercharger station in Rawlins, Wyoming. The driver was a 34-year-old software engineer from Seattle. He had been on the road for 3 days. He was driving to New York City. He had planned the route using a smartphone app that calculated charging stops. The car's navigation system had already routed him to this station. He plugged in. He did not talk to anyone. He stood by the car looking at his phone. In 15 minutes, he had enough range to continue. He got back in the car. The autopilot engaged as soon as he merged onto Interstate 80. He did not touch the steering wheel for the next 100 miles. Something had changed. What happened? The road trip had become automated. The driver was not experiencing the road in the same way as Jackson or the 1919 convoy. He was managing a machine. The car handled the navigation, the speed, the lane keeping. He was a passenger in his own vehicle. The freedom of the open road had been replaced by the efficiency of software. But was it freedom, or was it just another optimized transaction? Investigators, in a different sense, sociologists and urban planners, had been watching these trends for years. They studied how the rise of electric vehicles and autonomous driving would reshape travel behavior. The fear was that the road trip would become sterile, a series of controlled stops at standardized stations. The quirky diners and motels would be bypassed for charging stations and rest areas with Wi-Fi. The character of the journey would be flattened, but there was another side. The electric car made long-distance travel possible for people who could not afford gasoline at high prices. The cost per mile was lower. The maintenance was less. The range anxiety, while real, was being solved by better batteries. The road trip was not dying, it was evolving. At 8:14 a.m. on the 22nd of March 2020, a family from Chicago pulled into a gas station in Tucumcari, New Mexico. The station was empty. The main street was quiet. COVID-19 had shut down much of the country, but they had nowhere else to go. They had been planning this trip for a year. They were driving to the Grand Canyon. The father had printed out directions from MapQuest. The mother had packed sandwiches in a cooler. The children had coloring books. They had not checked the news that morning. They did not know that many national parks were closing. They drove on. They found the Grand Canyon Village locked. The gates were closed. A ranger told them the park was closed until further notice. They stood at the entrance looking at the canyon through the fence. It was still there. They turned around. They drove back to Chicago without stopping at any attractions. The trip was a failure in the traditional sense, but they had spent 5 days in the car, talking, arguing, laughing. That was the journey. What did they learn? That the road trip was not about the destination. It was about the fragile, unpredictable human experience of movement. The systems that had made the road trip possible, the gas stations, the motels, the diners, had been disrupted. Many closed permanently. The pandemic accelerated a shift that had already begun. The road trip became a survival strategy for some, a last resort escape for others. But it did not disappear, it adapted. How could this have happened? How could a global pandemic reshape an activity that had been so fundamental to American identity? It happened because the road trip was always about the freedom to move, and when movement was restricted, the value of that freedom became more visible. People who had never considered a road trip began to drive. Staycations became drivecations. The rental car industry boomed. RV sales hit record highs. In 2020, over 46 million Americans took a road trip. The highways were not empty. They were filled with new travelers learning to navigate a landscape that had changed. At 9 p.m. on the 14th of August, 2022, a crowd gathered at the Route 66 Historic District in Albuquerque, New Mexico. They were there for the annual Route 66 Summerfest. The street was lined with vintage cars. A 1965 Mustang, a 1957 Chevy, a 1932 Ford Roadster. The cars were polished. The owners wore period clothing. They were not driving across the country. They were preserving a memory. A woman in a poodle skirt stood next to a turquoise Bel Air. She told a reporter that she had driven Route 66 as a child in 1962. She remembered the motels with neon signs, the cafes with homemade pies, the gas stations where attendants checked your oil. She said it was all gone now, but she still came to the festival. She still drove her car. She still believed in the idea of the road. What remained? The infrastructure of nostalgia. The sections of Route 66 that had been preserved became tourist attractions. The old gas stations became museums. The motels became boutique hotels. The diners served the same burgers, but now for $20. The road had been transformed into a theme park version of itself, but it was not fake. It was real in the sense that people still wanted to experience it. The original road trip had been born out of necessity and curiosity. The new road trip was born out of memory and desire. At 10:30 a.m. on the 5th of October 2023, a van rolled into the parking lot of the Roy's Motel and Cafe in Ambo, California. The van was a 2004 Dodge Sprinter converted into a tiny home. Inside, a couple in their 30s had been living on the road for 2 years. They worked remotely. They had solar panels on the roof. They had a compost toilet. They had a Starlink dish for internet. They were part of a new wave, the digital nomad road trip. The journey never ended. They did not have a destination. They moved from place to place, staying a few weeks in each location. They called it van life. They posted videos of their travels on social media. They had followers. They earned money from sponsors. They were not escaping. They were living. What happened? The road trip became a lifestyle. For the first time in history, a person could work from anywhere with a reliable internet connection. The road was no longer a break from life. It was life itself. The mobile home had evolved from the covered wagon to the Airstream to the converted Sprinter. The journey was no longer a vacation. It was a career. The systems that made this possible, the gig economy, remote work technology, and social media platforms had created a new kind of road trip. It was not about crossing the country. It was about staying in motion. But there were failures. The infrastructure for full-time van life was not built for the volume of people who adopted it. Public lands became crowded. Boondocking sites overflowed with garbage. The locals in small towns resented the influx of transient workers who did not contribute to the local economy. The romantic image of the road tripper collided with the reality of limited resources. The system had not been designed for permanent transients. The tension between the freedom of the road and the responsibility of community became a central question. How could this have happened? How could the road trip, born from a bet between two adventurers in 1903, morph into a global movement of digital nomads? It happened because the core desire had not changed. The desire to move, to see, to discover, to be independent. The tools changed. The routes changed, the vehicles changed, but the impulse remained. Jackson and Winton would not recognize the highways of 2003, but they would recognize the spirit, the willingness to leave the known and enter the unknown. At 7 a.m. on the 20th of July 2024, a woman in her late 40s parked a bright orange Volkswagen Beetle at the start of the Lincoln Highway in Times Square, New York City. She had flown from Germany. She had rented the car from a company that specialized in vintage rentals. She was a filmmaker. She planned to drive the entire Lincoln Highway from New York to San Francisco in 14 days. She had a camera, she had a notebook. She wanted to document what remained of the original road. She knew that much of it had been replaced by interstates. She knew that many of the old diners had closed. She drove anyway. She said she needed to understand where the road trip came from. She needed to feel the distance. What did she find? She found that the highway still existed in fragments. In New Jersey, the road was a commercial strip. In Pennsylvania, it wound through small towns with brick buildings. In Ohio, it was a rural two-lane road lined with cornfields. In Indiana, it was a forgotten stretch of cracked asphalt. In Iowa, it was a main street. In Nebraska, it was a straight line across the plains. In Wyoming, it was a gravel road. In Utah, it was a desert track. In Nevada, it was a ghost town. In California, it was a suburban artery. She found that the road had not disappeared. It had been absorbed. The story was still there, written in the landscape. She arrived in San Francisco on the 10th of August, 2004. She parked the Beetle at the end of the Lincoln Highway near the Cliff House. The Pacific Ocean was gray. The wind was cold. She stood at the railing and looked back east. She had driven 3,000 miles. She had seen the country change from coastline to coastline. She had slept in motels that had been there since the one at was zeros. She had eaten at diners that served the same pie for 70 years. She had broken down twice. She had been helped by strangers. She had cried once in Nebraska because the sky was so wide. What does it mean? The great American road trip is not a thing, it is a process. It is a relationship between a person, a vehicle, and the land. The infrastructure has changed, the vehicles have changed, but the relationship persists. The original birth of the road trip was a wager. The outcome was a nation that could be crossed. The ongoing story is a nation that can be experienced. The failures, the breakdowns, the closed diners, the empty stations, they are not the end. They are the texture. They are the evidence that the road is alive. At 5 p.m. on the 17th of October 1973, a line of cars stretched for 2 miles outside a gas station in Portland, Oregon. The station was small. It had 2 pumps. The attendant was a teenage boy. He was overwhelmed. He had not seen anything like it. Drivers sat in their cars with engines running. The line moved slowly. Some drivers had been waiting for over an hour. The station owner came out and announced that he had already sold his daily allocation. He was closing early. The drivers honked. Some got out to argue. Others simply turned off their engines and sat in silence. What happened? The Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries had declared an oil embargo. It was aimed at the United States and other nations that had supported Israel during the Yom Kippur War. The embargo began on the 17th of October. By November, the price of oil had quadrupled. The United States was dependent on foreign oil. The country had built its transportation system around cheap gasoline. The road trip, that quintessential American pastime, was suddenly threatened. Gas stations ran out of fuel. Some limited purchases to 10 gallons per customer. Others closed for days at a time. On the 25th of November, President Richard Nixon addressed the nation. He announced a national speed limit of 55 miles per hour. It was meant to reduce fuel consumption. He also called for year-round daylight saving time and urged Americans to carpool. The speed limit was not a suggestion. It was law. State highways that did not comply risked losing federal funding. The interstate highway system, which had been designed for high-speed travel, was now forced to operate at a crawl. The road trip, which had been defined by speed and distance, was suddenly reduced to a slow, painful grind. How could this have happened? How could a single geopolitical event bring the American road trip to its knees? It happened because the road trip was built on a fragile foundation. The interstate highway system was a triumph of engineering, but it was also a hostage to oil. The system had no backup. There was no alternative fuel infrastructure. There was no public transit network that could replace the car. The American auto industry had focused on large, fuel-hungry vehicles. The typical family car in 1973 got about 12 miles per gallon. The road trip, which relied on cheap gas and long distances, was suddenly unsustainable. At 8 a.m. on the 1st of December 1973, a family from Chicago pulled into a gas station in St. Louis. They were driving a 1972 Chevrolet Impala. They were on their way to Los Angeles. They had planned a 2-week road trip. They had saved for months, but they had not accounted for the embargo. The station was out of gas. The next station was 10 miles away. They found it closed. The third station had a line of 40 cars. They waited 45 minutes. They bought 5 gallons. The father later told a reporter that they had to cut the trip short. They made it only to Oklahoma City before turning back. They had driven 2,000 miles round trip for nothing. What did investigators find? The federal government created a network of emergency fuel allocation systems. States set up odd-even rationing. Drivers with license plates ending in odd numbers could buy gas only on odd-numbered days. Even plates on even days. It was confusing. It was arbitrary. It did not always work. Some drivers filled up cans in their trunks. Others bribed station attendants. The black market for gasoline emerged. The system was not designed for scarcity. It was designed for abundance. When abundance disappeared, the system failed. The embargo lasted until March 1974, but the effects lingered. The 55 miles per hour speed limit remained in place. It was finally repealed in 1995, but only after decades of debate. The road trip culture had been permanently altered. The long, freewheeling drives across the country became shorter, more cautious. The romance of the open road was tempered by the reality of limited resources. The car itself changed. Manufacturers began producing smaller, more fuel-efficient vehicles. The muscle car era ended. The Japanese automakers entered the market with the Honda Civic and the Toyota Corolla. The road trip was no longer a Vate-powered adventure. It was an economy exercise. At 2 p.m. on the 15th of June, 1979, a man in a 1978 Ford Fairmont pulled into a gas station in New York City. He was a taxi driver. The station had gasoline, but at a price. The price had doubled in a year. The man filled his tank. He paid $60. A year earlier, the same fill-up had cost $25. He complained to the attendant. The attendant shrugged. The second oil crisis was underway. The Iranian Revolution had disrupted global oil production. Lines returned. Panic buying returned. The road trip, which had barely recovered from 1973, was again under threat. What investigators found was a pattern. The United States had not learned the lesson of 1973. The country had not reduced its dependence on foreign oil. The fuel economy standards introduced in 1975 had helped, but the number of vehicles on the road had increased. The interstate highway system continued to expand. The road trip remained a national pastime, but it was now a nervous one. The system had a deeper vulnerability. It was built on a single source of energy. The road trip, born of a wager between two men in 1903, was now hostage to geopolitics. How could this have happened? It happened because the road trip was not just a mode of travel. It was a symbol of American independence. To question the road trip was to question American identity. The government had invested billions in highways. The automotive industry had grown into a global powerhouse. The suburbs had been built around the car. The road trip was the ritual that connected all of it. The system was too large and too entrenched to change quickly. The failures of 1973 and 1979 were not just fuel shortages, they were systems failures. The nation had built a civilization on wheels without thinking about what would happen when the wheels stopped turning. At 10 a.m. on the 22nd of July 1980, a bus from the Interstate Commerce Commission arrived at a small town in Texas. The town was called Vega. It sat on Old Route 66. The commission was conducting a hearing. The subject was the future of the highway. Route 66 had been officially decommissioned in 1977. The signs had come down. The road was being replaced by Interstate 40. Local business owners had gathered to plead their case. They wanted the highway to stay open. They argued that the road still carried traffic. They argued that the motels and diners were still operating. The commission listened. Then they ruled. The road would be turned over to states. Most states would abandon the sections that ran parallel to interstates. The road trip's original spine was being dismantled. What happened? The interstate highway system had made Route 66 obsolete. The interstates were faster, safer, and more efficient, but they were also uniform. They bypassed towns. They avoided curves. They flattened the landscape. The road trip on the interstates was a different experience. It was a straight line. It was a blur. The diners and motels that had defined the old road were dying. The service stations closed. The neon signs went dark. The system of roadside commerce built over 60 years failed. The infrastructure of the road trip was being replaced by a new infrastructure, and the old one was being left to rot. How could this have happened? It happened because progress is not always kind. The interstate highway system was a monumental achievement. It connected the nation like never before, but it also erased the very texture that made the road trip unique. The road trip that Jackson and Winton had pioneered was a journey of discovery. The interstate highway was a journey of efficiency. The two were incompatible. The system that replaced the old roads was better in many ways, but it was also colder. The road trip had lost its soul. At 6 p.m. on the 1st of August 1995, a couple in a 1963 Chevrolet Corvette pulled into a motel in Tucumcari, New Mexico. The motel was called the Blue Swallow. It had been open since 1939. The neon sign still glowed. The owner was an elderly woman. She had operated the motel for 40 years. She told the couple that she had seen the road change. She had seen the traffic dwindle. She had seen the interstate pull away the travelers, but she kept the sign lit. She kept the rooms clean. She kept the rates low. She said she did it for the people who still remembered. What did investigators find? The motel was a survivor. The system had failed it, but the system had also failed the travelers. The road trip that had once been a shared cultural experience was fracturing. People drove faster. They stopped less. They ate at chain restaurants. They slept at chain motels. The experience was homogenized. The road trip was no longer a journey through local America. It was a journey through a branded America. The failure was not just of infrastructure, it was of connection. At 9 a.m. on the 12th of March 2008, a man in a 2007 Toyota Prius drove into a charging station in San Francisco. He was participating in a test. The station was one of the first public electric vehicle charging points in the country. The man plugged in the car. He waited 20 minutes. The battery was only half full. He drove away. He was a road trip enthusiast. He wanted to prove that an electric road trip was possible. He drove to Los Angeles. He charged 3 times. The trip took 12 hours instead of 6. He made it, but just barely. What happened? The electric car had arrived, but the infrastructure was not ready. The system of gasoline stations was ubiquitous. The system of charging stations was sparse. The road trip, which required range and speed, was incompatible with the technology. The failure was not the car, it was the network. The electric road trip was a test. It revealed that the system had to be rebuilt from the ground up. The road trip's future, if it had one, would require a new kind of fuel, a new kind of vehicle, a new kind of planning, and that would take time. At 11:30 a.m. on the 23rd of September 2029, a self-driving electric van pulled into a rest stop on Interstate 80 in Nebraska. The van was part of a pilot program. It had driven from New York to San Francisco without a human at the wheel. Programming had handled the navigation. The sensors had managed the traffic. The battery had been recharged at automated stations. The van arrived in San Francisco on schedule. The road trip, once the domain of human skill and endurance, had been automated. What did this mean? The system had evolved. The infrastructure had been retrofitted. The road trip was now possible without a driver. But was it still a road trip? The human element had been removed. The journey was no longer about discovery. It was about efficiency. The system that had been born from a bet between two men in 1903 had reached its logical conclusion. The road trip had become a fully automated, energy-efficient, network-optimized process, but something was missing. At 3 p.m. on the 14th of October 2031, a woman sat in the passenger seat of a self-driving RV in Montana. She was 70 years old. She had driven the same route 40 years earlier in a 1965 Mustang. She remembered the feeling of the steering wheel. She remembered the smell of the gas. She remembered the stops at diners where she talked to strangers. Now she sat in the passenger seat. The RV drove itself. The route was programmed. The food was pre-ordered. The stops were timed. She looked out the window. The landscape was the same, but the experience was not. What happened? The road trip had become a commodity. The freedom that it once represented had been replaced by convenience. The system had been optimized, but optimization is not the same as meaning. The failures of the road trip were not only about fuel shortages or infrastructure decay. They were about the loss of the spontaneous, the unscripted, the human. The road trip had been born out of a desire to explore. It had grown into a national ritual. It had survived crises. It had adapted, but in adapting, it had changed. The question was no longer how the road trip was born. It was whether it could survive its own success. At 6 a.m. on the 31st of December 2032, a man in a restored 1903 Winton parked his car at the starting point of the original Transcontinental Drive in San Francisco. He was the great-grandson of Horatio Jackson. He had spent years restoring the car. He planned to drive the original route following the roads that Jackson and Crocker had taken. He was not using GPS. He was not using a smartphone. He was navigating with maps from 1903. The car broke down 12 times. He slept in fields. He was helped by strangers. He arrived in New York City on the 28th of March 2033. The journey took 63 days. He said it was the best road trip of his life. What did that prove? It proved that the original spirit of the road trip could still be found. The system had changed. The infrastructure had evolved. The technology had advanced. But the core desire was still there. The desire to move, to struggle, to see, to connect. The road trip was never about the road. It was about the people who traveled it. The system could fail. The fuel could run out. The highways could crumble. The technology could automate. But as long as there was a person behind the wheel or even beside it, the road trip would survive. Not as it was, but as it could be. How could this all have happened? It happened because the road trip was never a fixed thing. It was a dynamic relationship between humans, machines, and landscapes. The failures were not endpoints. They were turning points. The embargoes, the infrastructure decay, the automation, the pandemic all forced the road trip to adapt, and adaptation is what kept it alive. The road trip that Jackson and Winton started in 1903 was not the same road trip that families took in 1955 or that digital nomads took in 2024 or that the great-grandson took in 2033, but it was still a road trip. The name changed, the vehicle changed, the route changed, the spirit endured. At 9 a.m. on the 1st of January, 2040, a young woman parked a 2029 electric sedan at the end of the Lincoln Highway in San Francisco. She had driven from New York. She had used self-driving mode for most of the trip, but she had turned it off in the Midwest. She wanted to feel the road, she wanted to steer, she wanted to stop at a diner that still existed from the old days. She found one in Illinois. The waitress was a robot. The pie was still homemade. She sat at the counter. She thought about the people who had come before. She thought about the filmmaker in 2004. She thought about the great-grandson in 2033. She thought about Jackson and Winton. She smiled, she took a picture, she posted it online. Then she got back in the car and drove home. What did it matter? It mattered because the road trip is not a destination, it is a process. It is a way of moving through the world. The systems that enable it will always change. The failures will always return, but the impulse to go, to see, to discover will never disappear. The great American road trip was born in a wager. It has lived through wars, embargoes, pandemics, and automation. It has been reshaped by every crisis. It will be reshaped again. The road does not end, it only changes. And as long as there is someone willing to turn the key, the road trip will continue.